to a point where potassium ions channels open and potassium leaves the cell, where the cell depolarizes, after which a refractory period occurs and then the resting potential is restored. So for the SD curve, the mathematical model that we are considering can take two forms. We can look at a hyperbolic model and an exponential model, which you have over here. So there's several advantages and disadvantages to both. There's not one that's completely right or wrong, but the idea is that we have the threshold for the generator current to see any kind of stimulation, and that's in terms of the rheobase current and then the Chronaxy, or in terms of a tissue or membrane constant for the exponential model. We have the signal propagation in neurons can be modeled as a circuit, as you can see here, which I would encourage you to look into if you have not considered this before. But this is related to this model ultimately. Properties of magnetic stimulation. Well, we can either measure it through the external applied magnetic field change or the internal current or electric field that's produced. And we can consider the rheobase of the stimulus or the physiological rheobase. And so for the hyperbolic SD curve, we can calculate the threshold change in magnetic field as such. And we end up with having a minimum change in magnetic field for peripheral nerve stimulation of 12.5 millitesla, and for cardiac stimulation, 480 millitesla. And this model, the hyperbolic SD curve model, is usually what is used with scanners, as MRI scanners typically have stimulation monitors. Biphasic change or peak-to-peak value of constantly changing beat is more relevant than the amplitude or the RMS value. In effect. So we can also consider the exponential SD curve, where if we consider a time much lower than the time constant, then the threshold change in magnetic field is equal to this, or approximately equal to this. And again, there are some pros and cons to each model. There's not one that's completely right or wrong. But in effect, we can look to see that the peripheral nerve stimulation ultimately depends more on the change in the magnetic field rather than the rate of change. And so if stimuli is strong enough, then the response increases with the increasing number of fibers that are recruited, nerve fibers. And so first, often you'll see perception being affected and then muscular twitching effects. It also seems to make, based on the electrical model for the neuron and the excitable tissue, there seems to be a dependence on the type of waveform. So unipolar stimuli have lower thresholds than bipolar stimuli. But for magnetic stimuli, as demonstrated by TMS studies, this is actually not what is observed. For very short stimuli, decreased stimulus duration and lower frequency means that the peripheral nerve stimulation threshold increases, and at frequencies above 25 kilohertz, the SD curve model changes and the thresholds become higher. Respiratory and cardiac stimulation does not occur with MRI units because the available conduction loop around the heart is significantly smaller than around the trunk. So your peripheral nerve stimulation occurs first, and we're usually trying to prevent that. To heart muscle, the time constant is 3 milliseconds, which is larger than the peripheral nerve, which is 0.5 seconds. Gradients don't generate a large enough delta B, and the scanner has stimulation software that is designed to prevent such stimulations. So there are precautions, and it's not a common issue that you see cardiac stimulation and respiratory stimulation. Peripheral nerve stimulation. From human studies, it's been observed that the rheobase mean has been 19.4 Tesla per second, and the Chronaxy being 0.42 seconds, the minimum change in magnetic field being 8.1 millitesla. Each gradient in the MRI unit has a different sensitivity, with the Y gradient having the lowest thresholds for stimulation, and the Z gradient having the least, being the least sensitive. At 150% of the threshold stimulus, the subjects begin to experience discomfort on average, and then at 200% of the threshold stimulus, the experience becomes intolerable, so to speak. The stimulation model in terms of the imaging gradient parameters can be described by this model over here. So delta G of T is equal to the smallest stimulating slew rate for infinitely long pulse durations times the Cronach C plus the change in the gradient, the smallest stimulating gradient excursion for infinitely short pulse durations. So the weighted mean minimum slew rate is 59.3 Tesla per meter second, and the minimum stimulating gradient amplitude is 35.4 millitesla per meter. And I encourage you to look at table 4.3 of the reference for this video to look at the peripheral nerve stimulation data from MRI gradient coils. So how can we predict and avoid PNS? Just first of all, we need to consider that it's not necessarily harmful, and most of the time it's not even intolerable or that unpleasant, but we do want to maximize the patient comfort and make the by avoiding it. So the likelihood of PNS does change with respect to, in relation to the type of MRI sequence being applied. So rapid sequences like echoplanar imaging sequences have higher rates of PNS. Also, any sequence with high Y gradient activity, such as like frequency encoding in EPI, diffusion imaging, where you have stronger gradients, high resolution images with higher gradients as well, and oblique slices. Exposure limits are described by the IEC, and which requires that manufacturers calibrate their PNS monitor from either actual volunteer exposure results or using the predefined SD curves. And the IEC default curve is hyperbolic for the SD curve. The gradients, since they have different sensitivities, they have different weighting factors, and so the AP weighting factor is 1, the left to right is 0.8, and the HF, the Z gradient is head to foot is 0.7. And so with that, we have a modified SD curve that we can look at. And so the vector sum of the weighted DBTT must be less than the PNS threshold. IEC PNS limits. So we have 3 different modes. The normal mode is limited to 80% of the median perception threshold. First level is 100% of the median perception threshold, and second level is less than 120% of the median perception threshold. And so we have our modified SD curves. For normal mode is typically what you're using in the clinic. A level 1 requires acknowledgement before use, and level 2 is a mode that is typically only accessible for research purposes and requires IRB or ethics committee approval. The IEC cardiac limits uses the exponential SD curve model as shown. And I would recommend you look at figure 4.23 in the reference text to look at the bioeffect spectrum for different sensory effects between 0 and 100 kilohertz.